Have you ever felt like something is out of place in your spiritual life? As if no matter how much you try to fit into the traditions and rituals of a traditional church, something in your heart is telling you there's more to discover? This video didn't come to you by chance. It's part of a calling to give you the wisdom to deal with these feelings. Have you noticed how religious institutions often seem disconnected from what really matters? Maybe at some point, you felt that what was supposed to be a source of spirituality and wisdom has turned into something routine, empty, where true connection with the divine takes a back seat. If you're feeling this way, know that it's natural, and many of the chosen are going through the same awakening process. God's presence in your life doesn't depend on rituals or rigid structures, and that's exactly what we're going to talk about today. Throughout this video, you'll understand why many of God's chosen are moving away from organized churches and how this choice can be spiritually liberating. We're not talking about abandoning faith, but rediscovering it in a purer and more authentic way. Your spiritual connection, your divine mission, is waiting to be lived freely without the constraints that often stifle true faith. Before we go further, I invite you to subscribe to the channel. The next steps will be full of content that will help you grow even more as one of God's chosen. Here you will find inspiration, wisdom, and support to continue your spiritual journey, living with more purpose and abundance. I'm immensely grateful that you're here today. Together we can strengthen this community of the chosen. You know, sometimes the feeling of being stuck in something that no longer nourishes our spirit is like carrying an invisible burden. Maybe you've noticed that no matter how hard you try, certain religious institutions no longer resonate with your essence, and there's nothing wrong with that. Leaving the organized church doesn't mean abandoning your faith. On the contrary, it can be an incredible opportunity to reconnect with the divine in a deep, personal way, free from the expectations that often suffocate genuine spiritual connection. When we step away from these structures, we often find a new way to draw closer to God in a way that is true and personal. It's curious, isn't it? When we talk about the idea of leaving these institutions, it seems like an immediate fear sets in. Fear of judgment, of what others will think, or even of being wrong for seeking another path. But the truth is, God never asked us to be prisoners of empty rituals or systems that don't nurture us. On the contrary, we were chosen to walk a path of wisdom and spiritual abundance that goes far beyond the walls of any building. You're here now because that search has already begun inside of you, and this is the first step toward a more authentic journey. I know it might seem a little scary at first. Leaving something we've been taught is right for so long is not an easy decision, but this is where each of our true divine missions comes into play. Spiritual freedom is a gift, a way to connect directly with the Creator without intermediaries or barriers. When you allow yourself to experience this freedom, you begin to understand that faith is not tied to rituals or physical places. It's within you, flowing directly between you and God in a spiritual connection that transcends any structure. And it's amazing how, when we let go of these old chains, we begin to see life through new eyes. Everything changes, and suddenly the wisdom we always sought in texts and sermons seems available in every moment, in everything we do. Our faith, once limited to Sundays and services, expands to every day of the week, to every moment of our lives. And that's when we realize that we were always chosen for this journey of deep connection with the divine, a mission much greater than we imagine. If you've ever felt that the practices and continues, routines within churches have lost their meaning, know that you are not alone. This happens to many of us. That's because spirituality is alive, dynamic. It adapts to our needs and calls us to a more intimate connection. And when we realize this, we understand that leaving an institution doesn't mean abandoning faith. On the contrary, it can be the most powerful way to nurture it. You are allowing yourself something that many fear, true freedom to follow your own divine mission. Sometimes we forget that a true connection with God never needed intermediaries. From the beginning, we were invited to a personal, direct relationship that doesn't depend on walls or rituals. When Jesus spoke about worshiping in spirit and in truth, he was reminding us that faith is something between us and God, not mediated by human structures. And that connection is something that grows, evolves, and transforms as we walk this path of wisdom and spiritual abundance. And mind you, this doesn't mean you'll be alone. Quite the opposite. When leaving these institutions, many find a community of other chosen ones who are also seeking this deeper connection. People who understand that the true spiritual path is in every step we take in faith, in every decision we make with wisdom. These encounters, these new connections, end up being even more meaningful because they are based on a sincere search for truth, not on empty rituals. Are you ready to live this freedom? I know the journey may seem challenging at first, but it's on this path that you'll find a connection with God that you may have never experienced before. And trust me, it's going to transform your life in ways you can't even imagine. That's the beauty of being chosen, knowing that something much greater is waiting for you, and that every step you take, even outside conventional structures, is a step toward wisdom and a spiritual connection that can only come from true freedom. Have you ever found yourself thinking about how some churches seem to have lost their focus? It seems that over time, they've drifted away from what truly matters: real spiritual connection. Instead of being places where we draw closer to the divine, many temples have become spaces preoccupied with numbers, material wealth, and rules that do little to nourish the soul. For those seeking a deep connection with God, this situation can feel disheartening. After all, the true divine mission cannot be reduced to numbers or earthly possessions. Unfortunately, many of these institutions have strayed from their original purpose, which is to nourish the spirit of the faithful, and have shifted their focus to institutional matters. It's as if the greater meaning has been lost amid bureaucracy, financial interests, and repetitive rituals. The truth is, for those who have been chosen by God, the search for wisdom and spiritual connection goes far beyond the four walls of a church. It is in every moment, in every step we take in our life's mission. The saddest part of all this is that, for many, the church should be the place to meet God, a space for spiritual renewal. However, it often turns into an environment of pressure, of human expectations that don't reflect the true essence of faith. God's chosen ones don't conform to this reality. Instead, they seek something deeper, more meaningful. Do you feel that too? Do you feel there's something beyond, something that the institutional structure seems incapable of offering? The church, as it was originally conceived, should be a starting point to guide us on our spiritual journey. But over time, many have turned this mission into something mechanical, forgetting that faith is alive and needs to be nourished with authenticity. For those who have a more intense connection with the divine, this lack of depth becomes obvious. And when that happens, it's natural to start questioning, am I truly finding God here? Is this my mission? And isn't it curious that the more churches focus on their own interests, the more people drift away? It's not because they're losing faith, but because they're searching for something more real, closer to their spiritual needs, and that search often lead us outside institutions. Not because we want to distance ourselves from God, but because we want to draw even closer to Him. We seek a spiritual connection that is true, without the obstacles created by systems that seem to have lost their way. I understand that for many, leaving the church might seem like a tough decision. After all, we were taught to believe that the church is where we find God. But what if I told you that the true spiritual connection could be beyond these institutions? That faith isn't confined to a physical space, but can be lived intensely in every step we take? When we realize that the original focus has been lost, we realize that the divine mission for each of us is much greater than the limitations imposed by a temple. When we free ourselves from these chains, we begin to see the true essence of our faith. It's not about following rituals or fulfilling human expectations, but connecting sincerely with the divine. And that connection is something no one can take from you. It's deeply rooted in your soul, like an inexhaustible source of wisdom and spiritual abundance. When you realize this, God's chosen ones naturally move away from what no longer resonates with their mission. So if you've already started to feel that the church is no longer nourishing you spiritually, perhaps it's time to reflect on what truly matters. The spiritual journey is unique for each of us, and often we are called to walk paths that are unconventional, but that doesn't mean we're alone. Quite the opposite. It's on this alternative path that we find an even deeper connection with the divine, a connection that transcends any institution. Spirituality is something alive, constantly moving, isn't it? I believe you've already noticed this in your own journey. God is dynamic. He is present in all the changes in our lives, in moments of joy, in challenges, in every phase. And that's precisely why it's so strange when we see some churches stuck in fixed patterns, repeating routines week after week as if faith were something mechanical. For those who have a deeper connection with the divine, this can be stifling. After all, how can we grow spiritually if we are trapped in practices that no longer reflect our evolution? Have you felt that your faith goes beyond the repetitive rituals that are often imposed on us? I believe that, as one of God's chosen, you also realize that faith cannot be contained in a static format. It needs freedom. It needs to breathe. The danger of clinging to religious rigidity is precisely this. It limits God's transformative power in our lives. When we simply follow rules and routines without questioning, we miss the chance to experience something greater, something that goes beyond imposed norms. Think about how God's nature is dynamic. He doesn't act the same way every time, nor does he respond to our prayers in predictable ways. And that's wonderful. It shows us that our relationship with him is alive, spontaneous. But when religious institutions place us within a rigid structure, we often end up stifling that spontaneity. We limit our spiritual connection to what we're told it should be, rather than opening ourselves to what it could truly be. And you know what's interesting? When Jesus walked among people, he didn't follow a rigid pattern. Each encounter he had was unique, full of compassion and understanding. He didn't cling to routines or rules, but acted according to the moment, according to each person's need. This teaches us that spirituality is about being present, about living faith authentically without being bound by dogmas that often no longer make sense for our spiritual journey. I know that sometimes it may feel safer to follow these routines because we've been taught to believe this is the right way to connect with the divine. But as you well know, God is much greater than any structure created by human hands. His wisdom and abundance cannot be limited by traditions or customs that no longer serve our spiritual growth. And true spiritual freedom comes when we allow our faith to be as dynamic as God's presence itself. It's curious how the more we seek this freedom, the more we realize how rigid some religious practices have become. Often they stop being a source of growth and becoming a burden, an obligation. But you, as a chosen one, know that your divine mission goes beyond this. God calls you to a journey of wisdom where every step is guided by him, not by rules that have often lost their meaning. By accepting this truth, you allow yourself to grow in extraordinary ways. You leave behind the rigidity of routines that no longer nourish you and open yourself to the dynamic relationship with God. This fluid and free spiritual connection is what truly transforms our lives. And when we open ourselves to this transformation, we discover that there is an abundance of wisdom at our disposal, just waiting for us to let go of the chains of rigidity. Have you ever stopped to think about how some rituals, once full of meaning, now feel empty? It's curious, but many of the practices we see in churches, which should nurture our spirit, have turned into mere formalities. Maybe you felt this at some point when you realized you're repeating gestures and words that, deep down, no longer feed your spiritual connection. This happens to many of God's chosen ones, who seek a deeper connection and feel that these rituals no longer reflect their journey. The truth is that over time, some rituals have lost their original meaning and become automatic. It's like singing a song without paying attention to the lyrics or following a recipe without savoring the food. When something meant to bring us closer to the divine turns into routine, we end up distancing ourselves from what truly matters. And Jesus himself warned us about this, didn't he? When he said, "These people honor me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me," he was speaking precisely of this disconnect between form and spirit. I know many of us grew up being taught to follow these rituals. We were led to believe that if we didn't fulfill certain practices, we were somehow failing. But the reality is that a true connection with God doesn't depend on empty gestures. It lies in the heart, in the sincere desire to connect with the divine in an authentic way. And this can't be achieved simply by following rituals without purpose. For those on a spiritual mission, this superficiality just doesn't make sense. As we grow spiritually, we start to realize that it's not the rituals that bring us wisdom and abundance, but the intention behind them. When we do something out of obligation, without spiritual involvement, we lose the essence of the act. But when we allow ourselves to question these rituals, freedom begins to emerge. Perhaps you've also wondered whether these rituals still make sense for your journey, and that's a sign you're seeking a deeper connection, something that goes beyond traditions. I believe that, like many, you may have felt uncomfortable simply following these practices without feeling that spiritual impact. That's because your connection with God is alive, always in motion, and can't be reduced to empty repetitions. True spiritual nourishment comes from authenticity, from the truth we carry in our hearts. And when rituals lose that meaning, they stop feeding our spirit, and we start searching for something greater, something that truly makes sense. You might ask yourself, if these rituals no longer connect me with God, what should I do? The answer lies in simplicity. True spiritual connection doesn't need complex rituals. It can happen in the silence of a moment of reflection, in a sincere prayer, or a simple act of gratitude. What truly matters is the depth of your feeling, the truth with which you approach the divine. This is the kind of connection that brings wisdom, guiding you in your divine mission. It's not about rejecting all rituals, but about understanding which ones still make sense for you. If something no longer resonates, maybe it's time to leave it behind and seek new ways to connect with the divine. God isn't tied to old practices. He is present in every new gesture of faith, in every sincere attempt to draw closer to Him. And this freedom to seek new ways of connection is a clear sign that you are on an authentic spiritual journey, seeking wisdom and abundance for your life. Have you felt that your connection with God could be more personal, more intimate? Sometimes it seems like traditional structures try to mediate this relationship, placing rules and intermediaries between us and the divine. But the truth is, we don't need anyone to tell us how to approach God. The spiritual journey is something unique, and each of us has been called to a specific mission. And that means our relationship with the Creator must also be unique. You, as one of the chosen, have the opportunity to walk an alternative path, free from what has been imposed by traditions that often no longer hold meaning. This personal journey with God can seem challenging at first, precisely because we've been accustomed to following a path laid out by others. But as you start walking this freer road, you realize how enriching it is to discover your own way of connecting with the divine. There are no rules dictating how this relationship should be. God is present in every moment of our lives, waiting for us to simply turn to Him with sincerity. And this spiritual connection can happen at any time, in any place, without the need for intermediaries. Imagine the freedom of knowing you can communicate with God directly, without barriers, without rituals that are often just distractions. It's an incredible feeling, isn't it? When Jesus taught us to pray in secret, He was showing us that true connection with God is simple, uncomplicated, and happens in the quiet of our hearts. We don't need grand ceremonies for this. What we need is authenticity. And on this personal journey, you discover that what matters most isn't what you do, but the intention with which you do it. And the most beautiful part is that by following this alternative path, you begin to see God everywhere, in the little things, in everyday moments. Everything becomes an opportunity to strengthen your spiritual connection. Every challenge you face, every joy you experience, becomes a meeting point between you and the divine. There's no longer a need to wait for Sunday to feel His presence. Your journey with God becomes something constant, alive, present in every detail of your life. I know many people still believe that the only way to be in communion with God is through the practices they were taught, but I'm here to remind you that you have the freedom to seek your own connection. This freedom is a gift, an open door for you to find new ways to draw closer to God without relying on intermediaries. And by doing so, you'll find that your faith becomes deeper, more authentic, because it comes directly from your heart. The alternative path, this personal journey with God, may seem lonely at times. After all, not everyone is willing to walk this route outside of institutions, but it's on this path that you discover who you truly are and the divine purpose reserved for you. And believe me, you are not alone in this search. Many other chosen ones are also walking this journey, each in their unique way, but all in search of the same thing, a purer, truer connection with the Creator. When you choose to follow this path, you discover that true spirituality isn't about following rules imposed by others, but about opening yourself to a personal relationship with God. And this journey brings with it an abundance of wisdom and peace. You begin to see the world with new eyes, realizing that God is guiding your steps in a way no institution ever could. And by opening yourself to this experience, you become more receptive to the divine mission placed in your life. If anyone taught us about the simplicity of faith, it was Jesus. He didn't need grand ceremonies, majestic temples, or complex rituals to connect with God. On the contrary, most of the time when we read about his moments of prayer, we see Jesus seeking solitude, withdrawing from the crowds, going to simple and quiet places. This shows us that true faith doesn't need grand spectacles. It is something born within us, in our deep connection with the divine, and can be lived naturally and without complications. Think of the many times Jesus withdrew to pray alone. He knew that true connection with the Father didn't depend on being in a sacred place or surrounded by other people. For him, it was in the stillness of the Spirit that God's voice became clearest. This example is a great lesson for us, especially for those who feel they need rituals or intermediaries to connect with the Creator. In truth, the simplicity of this relationship is what makes it so powerful and genuine. And you, as one of God's chosen, have the opportunity to experience this too. Faith, as Jesus showed us, is something intimate, personal. It isn't tied to human rules, but to a direct relationship with the divine, and that is liberating. Knowing that we don't need to meet a list of requirements or follow a specific tradition to be in communion with God gives us a sense of peace and freedom. The divine mission entrusted to us is to live this faith authentically, just as Jesus taught us, with humility, simplicity, seeking what really matters, our spiritual connection with the Creator. And isn't it interesting to think that even without the complexities we see in some religious practices today, Jesus' faith was unshakable? He showed us that we don't need elaborate rituals to draw close to God. All we need is an open heart, a willing mind, and a sincere desire to connect with the divine. That's what makes the difference. When we live our faith in this way, without complications, we realize that God is always accessible, present in every moment of our lives. Perhaps you've already experienced this simplicity in your spiritual journey. That moment when, without any grand preparation, you feel God's presence beside you, guiding your steps. This happens because faith is more about what we feel and live than about what we do. Jesus showed us that we can live our spirituality in a pure way without being tied to traditions that no longer make sense to us. And this is something we can all, as God's chosen, experience on our journey with Him. I know that for many, the idea of simplifying faith might seem contradictory. After all, we were taught to follow certain rituals and practices, but what Jesus taught us is that true faith is much more about the sincerity of our hearts than outward actions. And it is this that connects us deeply with the divine. When we free ourselves from the need to complicate our relationship with God, we begin to live our faith with much more authenticity, drawing closer to the wisdom and spiritual abundance He offers us. Jesus was the living example that faith can be lived simply, yet powerfully. And this simplicity doesn't diminish the depth of our spiritual connection. On the contrary, it allows us to be more attentive to God's presence in our lives. When we let go of external demands and focus on what truly matters, we find a peace that strengthens us, a wisdom that guides us, and a divine mission that becomes clearer in our journey. When we allow ourselves to step away from traditional religious institutions, we find a spiritual freedom that many can't even imagine is possible. It's like a weight is lifted off our shoulders, and suddenly we walk lighter, with a more open spirit. By leaving these structures, you begin to realize that God is not confined by four walls or pre-established rituals. On the contrary, He is everywhere, simply waiting for you to turn to Him in a sincere and authentic way. And this freedom is liberating, bringing a deeper and more personal connection with the divine. One of the great benefits of this spiritual freedom is that you begin to live your faith in a genuine way, without the need to follow patterns that often no longer make sense for your journey. You discover that you don't need intermediaries to draw closer to God. Everything you need is within you, your sincere desire to seek that connection. By stepping away from institutions, you open yourself to a new way of living spirituality, freer, where divine wisdom manifests more clearly and spontaneously. And I know it may seem scary at first. After all, we've been taught to believe we need these institutions to keep our faith alive. But in truth, many discover that their faith becomes even stronger once they leave these structures behind. That's because when we free ourselves from human expectations, we focus on what truly matters, our personal relationship with God. And this spiritual connection is something no institution can control or limit. It is yours, and you have complete freedom to live it in the way that resonates most with your soul. And don't be mistaken, this freedom doesn't mean you're drifting away from God. On the contrary, it allows you to get even closer to Him. Without distractions, without external noise, you begin to realize that God is present in every moment of your life, not just in formal moments of worship. Every step you take, every decision you make, you feel the divine presence guiding you, strengthening you, and this connection is unbreakable because it comes from a place of authenticity, from a sincere search for truth and spiritual wisdom. Another incredible benefit of this spiritual freedom is that you begin to live your divine mission more clearly. When we're tied to the expectations of an institution, we often drift away from our true purpose. But when we free ourselves from those chains, we start to see more clearly the path God has for us. And this clarity brings a sense of peace and security. We know we are exactly where we're meant to be, living according to the mission we were entrusted with. And look, this freedom also gives us the chance to connect with other chosen ones, people who are also on the spiritual journey outside traditional structures. This community, formed by people seeking a true spiritual connection, is incredibly powerful. Together you share wisdom, encouragement, and faith without the limitations imposed by institutions, and this exchange strengthens your spiritual journey even more, helping you grow and develop in your divine mission. When you allow yourself to live the spiritual freedom, you discover that there are no limits to what God can do in your life. Without the barriers imposed by rituals and human rules, you open yourself to a deeper connection with the divine, and this connection brings an abundance of wisdom and blessings. Every day, you feel more strengthened, more guided by God's hand, knowing you are exactly where you need to be. And this brings a peace that no institution could offer. Now that we've come this far, I invite you to deeply reflect on everything we've discussed. How is your connection with the divine? Is it based on rituals and norms, or is it a personal journey full of authenticity and freedom? Maybe now is the time to stop and ask what is truly nourishing you spiritually. Sometimes we hold on to structures that no longer serve our growth, but the beauty of your journey as one of God's chosen children is that you have the freedom to make that choice. Think carefully. Everything you need to connect with the Creator is within you. It's not institutions that define your faith, but your desire to seek a true connection with God. And that, my friend, is powerful. When you decide to live your spirituality authentically, without the chains imposed by others, you begin to discover the true purpose of your divine mission. So I ask you, are you ready to take that step, to free yourself from the expectations placed on you and embrace the fullness of your spiritual connection? Life is full of opportunities for us to grow spiritually. Every decision we make can bring us closer to or further from God. But the good news is that you are in control of this journey. You can choose to walk a path of wisdom, of spiritual abundance, without depending on norms imposed by others. And this freedom is a gift. It's a chance to live your divine mission with authenticity, with faith, knowing that God is with you every step of the way. The question is, will you accept this call? If all of this resonated with you, I encourage you to take the next step. Keep seeking this deep connection with the divine, without fear of letting go of what no longer makes sense. And don't keep this message to yourself. Share this truth with those who are also ready to awaken. Do you know someone who needs to hear this? Someone who is feeling this call, but might not know how to act yet? Spread this message. Together, we can create a community of chosen ones, strengthening each other on this spiritual journey. I thank you for coming this far with me. It's a privilege to be able to share these reflections and to know that we are, in some way, connected in the search for the divine. And if you feel that this journey has been inspiring you, I invite you to subscribe to the channel. In the upcoming videos, we'll continue exploring themes that will help you grow even more as one of God's chosen ones. Turn on notifications so you don't miss any content that will strengthen you on this path. Now, I want to leave you with one last thought. How can you apply all of this to your life starting today? Don't let this opportunity pass. You are capable of transforming your spiritual journey, of making choices that bring you even closer to God. And that transformation starts now with your decision to live the spiritual freedom. Are you ready to fully live your divine mission?